When Portuguese ships first appeared off the West African coast, they didn't encounter tribes. They met a kingdom with structure, wealth, and diplomacy, the Kingdom of Benin. This documentary-style video explores the powerful dynamics of Benin and the Portuguese during the late 15th to 17th centuries. Through epic storytelling and historical depth, we unravel how Obas traded for muskets, influenced politics, and how this ancient empire navigated the crossroads of diplomacy, warfare, and European ambition. The sky was clear, the waters calm, and the people of Benin were going about their day when something strange appeared on the horizon. White wings floating on the sea. They weren't birds. They were ships. Huge, towering vessels unlike anything ever seen before, cutting through the Atlantic waves like gods had sent them. The people gathered, eyes wide. Who were these beings with skin like chalk and clothes that shimmered? They brought thunder in their hands, sticks that roared and spat fire. But they didn't come as conquerors, at least not at first. This wasn't some remote tribal land. The Portuguese hadn't stumbled upon a wilderness. They had arrived at the gates of an empire, the Kingdom of Benin, a civilization as orderly, rich, and sophisticated as any they had known back home. There were wide streets, complex taxation systems, monumental architecture, and a ruler so revered. His name was spoken only in whispers, the Oba. But what happened next wasn't just a meeting. It was a collision of ambition, diplomacy, and power. Why did the Oba allow them in? What did Benin seek from these strangers? And how did muskets become tools not just of war, but of legacy? This is the story of a forgotten empire and a critical moment in world history. It's the story of Benin and the Portuguese, of Obas and muskets, of golden diplomacy and shadowy deals. It's a story that begins with awe and ends with echoes that still ring through the corridors of time. Because when cultures meet, history doesn't whisper, it thunders, and it all began when the sails appeared. Long before the white sails touched African shores, the Kingdom of Benin stood tall and proud, a beacon of civilization in West Africa. Not just a kingdom, but an empire, forged through centuries of power, war, and divine order. At its core was the Oba, the divine king. Not merely a political figure, the Oba was believed to be a living deity, descended from Oranmiyan, son of the Yoruba god Oduduwa. His word was law, his presence sacred. No one looked him directly in the eye. No one spoke his name in vain. He was the heart of the empire, the axis upon which the world of Benin spun. Benin City, the empire's capital, was a marvel of urban planning. European explorers who arrived later described wide, straight roads, broader and better kept than many in Lisbon or Paris. At night, streets were lit with palm oil lamps, and houses stood neatly behind intricately carved walls. The city was enclosed by massive earthworks, walls and moats that stretched for thousands of kilometers, rivaling even the Great Wall of China in scale. But the strength of Benin wasn't just in stone and soil, it was in structure. Society was layered and complex. At the top were nobles and royal advisors, the Uzama, who helped guide the Oba's decisions. Then came a class of warriors, merchants, priests, artisans, and farmers. Every role was respected. Every citizen had purpose. Benin was a hub of commerce. Caravans traveled north to connect with trans-Saharan trade routes, while coastal ports welcomed merchants from far and wide. They traded ivory, pepper, leopard skins, coral beads, and cloth dyed in stunning indigo. And then there was the art. Benin's bronze plaques and sculptures were not mere decorations. They were historical records, spiritual symbols, and instruments of power. Made with lost wax casting techniques, these masterpieces depicted warriors, royalty, and deities. each piece a testament to the empire's refinement and cultural depth. Religion in Benin blended ancestral worship with belief in powerful spirits known as Orisha. Festivals were elaborate with masks, dance, and drumming that could stir the soul of even the gods. This was not a place waiting to be discovered. It was a civilization already in full bloom, rich in culture, steeped in tradition, and prepared for the world on its own terms. When the Portuguese arrived, they did not bring civilization. They found it. It was the late 15th century when the Portuguese, under Prince Henry the Navigator's grand vision, began exploring West Africa. Gold, spices, and new routes to Asia drove their ambition, but what they found in Benin wasn't just another stop, it was a revelation. The Portuguese had met many African polities before Benin, some hostile, some welcoming, but Benin was different, organized, powerful, and confident. When João Afonso de Aveiro first made contact with the kingdom around 1485, he wasn't treated like a conqueror or a savior. He was received as an envoy, granted audience by the Oba himself, believed to be Oba Ozolua, a ruler known as the Conqueror. The Oba was curious. These pale men from across the sea spoke of strange lands and powerful monarchs. They brought gifts, metal goods, coral beads, and something that sparked immediate fascination: muskets, the thundersticks. The Portuguese, equally intrigued, saw in Benin a gateway to the riches of the interior. But what truly astonished them was the level of civility. There were laws, a standing army, tax systems, palatial compounds, and a sophisticated diplomacy apparatus. This wasn't a tribal encounter, it was a geopolitical meeting. Talks began. The Portuguese were keen on acquiring pepper, ivory, and, eventually, slaves. Benin, meanwhile, saw opportunity in Portuguese metals, textiles, horses, and especially firearms. Muskets, while primitive by modern standards, represented a revolutionary leap in warfare. For a kingdom constantly fending off rival powers, these weapons could mean the difference between domination and decline. But trust was cautious. Each side operated with deep calculation. The Portuguese envoys brought Catholic missionaries hoping to convert the Benin elite. The Oba allowed them for a time, but always kept his distance. He was open to trade, not to being ruled. While some aspects of Portuguese culture were accepted, others were politely declined or quietly resisted. One of the most extraordinary outcomes of this contact was diplomacy through exchange. Benin sent ambassadors to Lisbon. Imagine African dignitaries walking through the cobbled streets of Europe in the 15th century, dressed in elaborate regalia, representing an empire few Europeans had ever heard of. They were received with awe and recorded in Portuguese documents as men of stature and intelligence. But all was not harmony. Misunderstandings brewed beneath the surface. The Portuguese viewed Benin through a colonial lens. They admired its wealth, but always with a glint of exploitation. They were already deep into the Atlantic slave trade, and though Benin initially limited slave exports, tensions over this issue would rise in decades to come. Still, for a brief window, this was a golden age of cautious cooperation. Trade posts were established near the coast. Portuguese merchants lived in Benin territory, under watchful eyes, and the Oba's court began integrating foreign goods into ceremonial life. European brass melted down and recast into iconic Benin bronzes, some depicting Portuguese soldiers with their pointed beards and helmets. The people of Benin, ever pragmatic, evaluated these strangers not as saviors or enemies, but as tools, potential allies, dangerous disruptors, or both. Elders debated, priests divined, and the Oba weighed his options. This first contact was no accident. It was a dance, delicate, deliberate, and dangerous. Two civilizations peering into each other's world for the first time, each curious, each cautious. and while the ocean separated them, trade and tension would forever bind them. For centuries, the Obas of Benin had ruled with divine authority, backed by ancestral spirits and a disciplined army of archers, spearmen, and elite warriors known as the Ilohins. But when the Portuguese introduced muskets, those thunderous sticks of fire, the very fabric of warfare in West Africa, began to shift. Oba Ozolua, who reigned during this pivotal period, was no passive monarch. Known for expanding Benin's territory through diplomacy and battle, he quickly recognized the strategic value of European firearms. The Portuguese didn't just offer trade, they offered leverage, and Ozolua seized it. Through carefully negotiated deals, the Oba acquired limited shipments of muskets, along with Portuguese gunners to train his troops. This wasn't a flood, it was a trickle. The Oba knew better than to give away his kingdom's autonomy for a few weapons. He played a delicate game, maintaining control while extracting maximum advantage. The introduction of firearms didn't just change battles, it changed politics. Neighboring kingdoms, used to matching Benin with bows and blades, found themselves suddenly outgunned. With muskets in hand, Benin's forces could launch more effective raids, suppress rebellions, and assert dominance over trade routes. This bolstered the Oba's image as not only a sacred ruler, but a modern warlord, a king who wielded divine blessing and European firepower alike. But muskets were more than tools of war, they were symbols. In Benin's ceremonial processions, Portuguese firearms were paraded alongside ivory tusks and royal regalia. They appeared in brass plaques and bronze sculptures not as foreign objects but as emblems of Oba power. Portuguese soldiers, their features carefully etched, long noses, wide eyes, metal helmets, became part of the visual language of the empire. Yet power always comes with a price. Muskets required gunpowder and maintenance, commodities controlled by the Portuguese. This dependency introduced a new kind of vulnerability. While the Oba retained political autonomy, his military edge became increasingly tied to European supply lines. And the Portuguese, ever shrewd, used this leverage to extract more favorable trade terms, especially in human cargo. As the 16th century progressed, the trade balance began to tilt. Portuguese demands for slaves grew, and while Benin resisted large-scale participation in the Atlantic slave trade for decades, economic and political pressures mounted. Firearms became currency in a world where human lives were becoming commodities. Oba Esigye, Ozolua's successor, tried to recalibrate. He expanded diplomatic ties with Portugal, allowed missionaries to build churches, and encouraged intellectual exchange. But he too understood the weight of muskets. They weren't just weapons, they were bargaining chips, diplomatic tools, and instruments of deterrence. In Benin, the military hierarchy adapted. Specialized units trained with firearms were established, often led by officers versed in both traditional tactics and Portuguese-style gun formations. These weren't ragtag militias, they were professionalized corps embedded in a larger disciplined army, and the Oba remained supreme commander. Yet the deeper the kingdom waded into military modernization, the more entangled it became in foreign politics. Rival states, also seeking firearms, turned to other European powers. The Dutch, the English, and later the French began entering the West African arena. Benin's monopoly eroded, and its once exclusive access to Portuguese weaponry became one of many. This led to new tensions both within and beyond the kingdom. Still, during its peak, Benin was unmatched. The combination of ancient legitimacy and modern weaponry made the Oba not just a ruler, but a force of history. European merchants might have held the keys to gunpowder, but they never held the throne. And that delicate balance between foreign innovation and local sovereignty defined Benin's strategy for decades. Muskets had entered the empire, but the soul of the kingdom still beat in bronze, blood, and ancestral pride. As trade between Benin and Portugal deepened, so did cultural curiosity. But unlike the lopsided exchanges often seen in colonial encounters, this was mutual. Benin absorbed aspects of Portuguese presence with purpose, never submission, and Portugal, though powerful, often found itself navigating a world that didn't bend to its norms. The Portuguese brought more than goods. They brought beliefs. Missionaries arrived with crosses and catechisms, hoping to convert the Benin elite. Churches were constructed, sermons delivered, and Christian names offered to the Obas court. At first, the relationship seemed promising. Obas of Benin, known for his diplomacy, allowed these missions to proceed, even adopting some Christian customs for political leverage. But conversion in Benin wasn't spiritual surrender. It was strategic accommodation. The kingdom didn't abandon its gods. It embraced the Portuguese as just another divine force among many. The Oba remained the ultimate spiritual authority, and ancestral worship continued uninterrupted. Christianity was practiced by a few elites and foreign residents, but it never took root in the soul of the kingdom. This duality ran deep. Benin artisans, fascinated by Portuguese appearance, began immortalizing them in bronze. Figures with European armor, curly beards, and muskets were cast with the same reverence as warriors and deities. These weren't caricatures, they were acknowledgments of power and curiosity. The Portuguese became part of Benin's visual canon, but always within a local frame. And yet, even as exchange blossomed, misunderstandings brewed. To the Portuguese, Benin was a marvel, but also a puzzle. Why didn't they convert en masse? Why did they maintain strict control over trade and diplomacy? Some believed Benin's rulers were stubborn. Others thought they were clever. Few understood that Benin wasn't resisting modernity, it was redefining it. Language barriers, religious misalignments, and differing worldviews led to tensions. Portuguese officials sometimes interpreted cultural pride as arrogance. Benin's court, meanwhile, grew wary of foreign ambitions wrapped in silk and scripture. Still, the flow of ideas continued. Benin emissaries traveled to Lisbon, absorbing European court customs while maintaining their identity. They observed naval technology, learned new techniques in metallurgy, and studied foreign languages, not to mimic, but to master. Yet the paradox remained. Both sides learned from each other, but never truly understood one another. This was not just trade, it was a mirror. Each empire saw its reflection in the other, strange, familiar, threatening, and inspiring, and from that mirror emerged a new chapter of history, one forged not just in iron or ivory, but in the complexities of mutual fascination. At first, the relationship between Benin and Portugal was marked by mutual gain and respect, but beneath the surface a slow rot began to spread, driven by a single devastating commodity: human beings. The Portuguese thirst for slaves grew insatiable. With colonies in Brazil and plantations in the Americas expanding, they needed labor, cheap, expendable, and endless. West Africa became their hunting ground, and they turned to kingdoms like Benin to supply it. Benin, proud and politically advanced, initially resisted large-scale participation. The Obas understood what was being asked. They saw the human cost, the social disruption, the moral weight. Slavery existed in Benin before the Europeans, but it was different, more akin to indentured servitude, a system embedded in justice and kinship. What the Portuguese proposed was something far darker: mass exportation, commodification, an industry of souls. For a time, the Obas pushed back. Trade in ivory, pepper, and textiles continued, and Benin limited the number of captives handed over. But pressure mounted. European guns were no longer just tools, they were necessities. And more Europeans, Dutch, English, French, arrived, offering better deals, more weapons, greater incentives for slavers. The balance began to tip. Obas of Benin's successors faced difficult choices. External threats were rising. Internal factions were fracturing. Some nobles saw opportunity in slave trade profits. Others feared dependency and cultural decay. Gradually, Benin found itself drawn into a system it once resisted, trading lives for leverage, bodies for barrels of gunpowder. Trust with the Portuguese eroded. Deals once honored with ceremony were now tainted by deceit. The Portuguese demanded more slaves than agreed, manipulated prices and forged alliances with Benin's rivals to increase their leverage. Benin, in turn, began limiting access, closing ports, and even launching attacks on certain European outposts when exploitation crossed the line. The era of diplomacy had become one of distrust. The kingdom fractured under the strain. Some vassal states revolted, either enraged by central control or eager to capitalize on the chaos. Others aligned themselves with rival European traders, shifting the geopolitical sands beneath the empire's feet. By the 17th century, the relationship between Benin and Portugal was a shadow of its former self. The Obas began restricting contact. Missionaries were expelled. Trade became limited to specific points under tight supervision. Benin, once open to the world, began to wall itself off, not from fear, but from betrayal. Still, the scars remained. Villages emptied, families torn apart. A generation of young men vanished across the ocean, never to return. The social fabric, once tightly woven, began to fray. And yet, Benin endured. The Obas adapted. Some redirected their economy. Others sought alliances with different European powers, trying to reset the terms of engagement. But the golden age of balanced exchange was over. Now every negotiation came with suspicion. Every trade, a question. Every ally, a potential traitor. The kingdom learned a brutal truth. Power traded on human suffering corrodes all who touch it. What began as a meeting of equals had transformed into a struggle for survival. Still, the legacy of resistance lived on. Benin never allowed itself to be colonized during this era. It never surrendered its throne. Its bronzes still depicted proud warriors and watchful Obas. And even as the slave trade reached its horrific peak, the kingdom found ways to assert agency, limit exploitation, and remember who it was before the sails appeared. In this chapter of betrayal and shifting alliances, Benin walked a treacherous path, trying to navigate between foreign pressure and ancestral dignity. It was a path soaked in tragedy, but also in resilience. Centuries have passed since Portuguese sails first touched the shores of Benin. The muskets have rusted. The traders are gone. The missionaries forgotten. But what remains is something more enduring: memory. The story of Benin and the Portuguese lives not just in archives, but in bronze. Cast by master artisans who worked under the gaze of Obas, Benin bronzes are among the greatest treasures of African art. They tell stories in metal of kings, warriors, rituals, and yes, foreigners. In these bronzes, Portuguese figures appear again and again, their beards, their armor, their firearms, rendered in astonishing detail. But they're never the center, always a part of the scene, never the heart of it. These were not tributes, they were chronicles. Benin used art as history, capturing moments of cultural contact and asserting control over their interpretation. The bronzes weren't passive, they were political. Each piece declared, "We remember, we saw, we chose." But memory isn't always comfortable. The trade with the Portuguese introduced firearms that changed warfare, and also chains that bound people. The kingdom that once sought diplomacy found itself pulled into a global web of slavery. Guns made Benin powerful, but they also made it dependent. Even today, debates rage about how to interpret this legacy. Was Benin a victim of European greed or a sovereign power making hard choices in a dangerous world? The answer, as always, is complex. It was both and neither. One thing is certain: Benin's story is not one of collapse, but of adaptation. When the relationship with Portugal soured, Benin didn't crumble, it recalibrated. The Obas withdrew from exploitative trade, doubled down on internal strength, and fortified cultural identity. And while some economic opportunities slipped away, the kingdom preserved its sovereignty for centuries to come. That legacy echoes today in the calls for the return of stolen Benin bronzes, looted by the British in 1897 and scattered across Western museums. These aren't just artifacts, they're testimonies. They speak of a kingdom that engaged the world on its own terms and paid the price for doing so. They also remind us that history is not flat. It is layered, emotional, and alive. The encounter between Benin and the Portuguese wasn't just about trade, it was about perspective. Two powerful societies met. They negotiated, exchanged, clashed, and remembered. And what they left behind still shapes how we see Africa, Europe, and the very meaning of civilization. When the Portuguese arrived at the shores of Benin, they didn't discover savagery. They found sovereignty. They didn't bring light. They found brilliance. The Kingdom of Benin stood not as a backdrop to European ambition, but as a player, calculated, complex, and commanding. This story is not just about trade. It's about vision. The Obas of Benin saw beyond the sails. They saw opportunity, danger, and diplomacy. They harnessed foreign power without surrendering their throne. They adapted without abandoning their identity. But history is rarely clean. Muskets brought power and dependency. Diplomacy brought knowledge and betrayal. And trade brought wealth and chains. Benin, like many empires, walked the fine line between advancement and loss, strategy and compromise. And yet, the heart of the story remains this: Benin was never passive. It was never a blank page for Europe to write on. It chose, it resisted, it redefined. Today, as the world confronts its colonial past, the story of Benin and the Portuguese demands to be told, not as a tragedy or a triumph, but as a truth that reveals the agency of African kingdoms, a truth that challenges Eurocentric myths, a truth cast in bronze, carried by memory, and echoed through time. So when we look at the Benin bronzes, we don't just see art. We see a conversation, we see resistance, we see a kingdom that met Europe eye to eye, and left behind a legacy that still speaks. If this story moved you, like the video, share it, and subscribe to the channel for more untold histories that deserve the spotlight. Because history doesn't just belong in textbooks, it belongs in our voices.